Welcome to the Inner Athlete Podcast, where we discuss all things youth athlete development and youth mentoring. Welcome back to the Inner Athlete Podcast. I've got a special guest here, Tim Schleiger. Is that how you pronounce your surname?
Correct.
Oh, thank you. Good. I'm glad I got that out of the way. Tim works in the soccer world, professional himself, professional player, and now he's working in Melbourne with a lot of NPL, I guess a couple of Aussies at the moment, I guess in the pipeline essentially.
A lot of A-League players, consult to all the major clubs.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, I played as a, back in the South Melbourne era in the old NSL days, and, used to go on loan and play out in the State League. An injury for me, in those days I had what was called osteitis pubis. But in those days there was no understanding of it, so I had 3 or 4 groin operations, and by my sort of early to mid-20s I was cooked. But I was studying at that stage, human movement and postgrad biomechanics and that sort of stuff, so it was a pretty easy transition for me. So I moved over from the player into what I saw as, strength and conditioning and basically a new way to look after athletes.
Yeah, when was this?
So this was sort of all through the mid-90s.
Yeah, so this is early S&C days in
early
Australia.
S&C. Back I think in the day where if you called yourself a personal trainer, there was probably about 5 of us.
Yeah.
And you actually knew them. They were involved at a football club in those days it was the fitness advisor. There's no high performance coaches or anything like that. And so then I worked and consulted with, NBL basketball. I worked with AFL, and then began a clinic and a personal training business. It was the old Too Good Personal Trainers. And so that business thumped out through the 90s, and we got right into our corrective exercise rehab, and it evolved into a physiotherapy clinic. So today it's called the Sports Clinic of Melbourne, based in Paran, and we've got a great team of sort of young sports physios, all done their masters, and they're really passionate about sport coverage. And then also through to now we've got the Sports Clinic of Football around the corner from you in Moorabbin, which is a 24/7 soccer gym, and it's also, we've got treatment and clinic down there as well, specifically targeting the round ball game, even though I still do consulting with AFL players down there, but we're really trying to target and educate parents and young footballers, just to teach them from my experiences, having worked in England and worked in the Middle East and worked with so many top players internationally, to try and give them the advice that I've seen over 25, 30 years, both as a player but then also in the rehab setting, in high performance, in strength and conditioning.
Yeah, so let's get into that with your expertise with youth and working with youth footballers. Kind of like, what are the big problems that you're seeing with youth footballers in Australia today?
The biggest issue that young footballers have is, and I think we've got to look back historically. So if we look at the period that I worked with, which is often deemed the golden generation, they were top athletes and they were footballers. These days we tend to produce footballers, but they're not top athletes. And so many of the injuries, probably all of the injuries I see in young footballers is simply a case of them not being strong enough to play the game.
Yeah, so would you say that's more like an early specialisation, and they're just kind of like double down in one specific area of becoming a footballer and very skillful, and not looking at all the other components of fitness that will, I guess, complement them on the pitch? Correct.
And so my dear friend Vince Grella, ex-Socceroo, played captained Empoli in the Serie A, played at Blackburn Rovers in the Premier League. He is now vice president of Catania, a club in Sicily, and he says, there's more academies in Victoria for soccer than there are in the whole of Italy.
Wow.
So you've got a lot of people cashing in on the profits of potentially producing young players and telling, trips to Spain and trips to England and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of these players, because of they have to be spoken to so nicely today, sometimes have an unrealistic expectation of what's involved. And so you'll often hear some academies tell stories where they went over there and played the Ajax played the Ajax youth team or something and get beaten 18-0. You know,
Jeez.
it's just they're that far off it. So historically, we look at that golden generation. Football Australia or the FFA got very involved in the curriculum and the Dutch model and all that sort of stuff. And somewhere I think as a football nation, we kind of lost our identity a little bit of who we are. And, you know, I tell the story a lot that Harry Kuehl and I used to, you know, spar 6 3-minute rounds of boxing before we even started gym. You know, he was a tough mofo, and a lot of people saw him as the great player at Liverpool, super skillful, etc. He's a machine. And then even now, he'll do his Peloton sessions a couple of times a day. Up in Glasgow, where he's working with Ange. Before that, he's at the home in Manchester, and he's a beast, you know. And that's the thing that's missing, is I don't really see too many players that I look at and go, wow, what a beast. And if you're a beast and a competitor and you've got some technical ability, then we're talking.
Yeah. I don't know how else to follow up with that. But then, I guess, how do we fix it? Like, we've got this problem of, you know, where the golden age was really good. We had the athletes and the players combined together. And then we've gone through like a dead spot, essentially, in terms of the development side. And then we focused too much on the sport of soccer. And then now we're trying to, I guess, go back to that to some degree in more of a new age approach. So how do we actually go about it?
Well, the advice I give to players and parents is just for them to understand, if they want to make it, they have to actually feel different and be different. Because even if I look at Melbourne City, and, you know, the academy's been running now for, I think it's, let's call it 12 years. I think there's probably a half a dozen players. One of my good kids, Nathaniel Atkinson, who's over at Hearts, was a classic over from Tasmania. He's worked his way through the youth team and the under-21s to play and represent his country, etc. You know, so the likelihood of, even if your kid's at Melbourne City or Melbourne Victory or Western United, in those sort of under-21, 23s teams, the likelihood of you still going through is still very low. So if people say, well, I'm there and abouts in that group, I want to see that they're doing something different. So if the coaches are saying he shouldn't be doing any strength and conditioning because that'll ruin the loads and everything that we're doing with you, like, be the beast. Go off and do some extra strength and conditioning. Find someone that knows a bit about the game and is a football person that's done some S&C and can improve you as an athlete. And don't be dumbed down and listen to people that maybe aren't true football people and are perhaps curbing your development. Because I know all those boys from Bresh, Carl Valeri, they were such workhorses. No one ever really told them to do, because the coach knew that they could be trusted to look after themselves, because they were just, Johnny Aloisi, the one percenters, were just so good at doing all of those things. And not saying we haven't produced some good players, because obviously we had a fantastic World Cup in the end, but they're just fewer. And we need to just start to say to these parents and players, don't be so worried about the sports scientists saying you've done a bit too much. You know, a day off could still consist of some Pilates to work on your core stability, given that, you know, adductor, OP, low back is still such a big part to injuries in the round ball game. So a Pilates session could be done twice a week as part of your recovery even. That is not going to tire you, but a lot of the modern day sports science kids will come out and say, oh, no, we need a rest. I'm worried about that it's too much for the player. How are they going to go and play in somewhere like the Championship in England, where you're on a coach all week, playing 3 games a week, high press, getting kicked and battered from, you know, pillar to post? That's something we've got to start to address in this country.
Yeah, it sounds like they haven't built that durability.
Correct, absolutely.
So, that's some of the things we see here as well, is a lot of the coaches throughout the ages. And I guess it comes back to the old saying, like, oh, kids shouldn't do strength training until the age of 16, which still kind of floats around to this day as well. We're seeing that kind of that myth kind of decline over time as well, which is really good to see. And then the recommendation for kids to get into strength training is basically when they can actually take instructions, which is really good to see on that perspective. the one thing I am seeing is, parents like yourself, we're seeing some other parents as well who were former national level athletes are like, yes, we know that this is good. We wish we had this when we were younger as well. Then they put them into programs, whether it's with us or with you guys as well. And then we see that growth and long-term development. Then the other thing we see as well, they enjoy the sport a lot more. They see more results. They're more consistent. The coach is like, all right, this kid is really good at what he's doing, or he's just really good at seeing that gradual development and growth in their sport and their skills. And then a lot of people don't realize if a kid is really skilled at their sport but actually quite weak as well, strength will actually further express their skills. And that's the other thing we don't talk about as well, because it's from a neuromuscular perspective. So if the kid can kick pretty accurately with a little bit of heat behind it, then you just put him on an 8-week program as a minimum, he's going to see some pretty remarkable results in his kicking.
And I use the analogy a lot where it's like, how many times are you going to impact a game? So he's a very dear to me young Danny De Silva, who was signed at Roma when he was 15. He went on loan to Roda in Holland and then ended up back in Australia with, he's been at Central Coast Mariners, he's at Macarthur now. But he was a classic, had all these amazing skills and was like better skills than I would have ever had in a million years, like such a talent. But he was just, he had the build at the time of a kid hanging out in the skate park. Like he was just very thin and just didn't really have what he required. And at that stage, this huge talent was playing in the Dutch First Division and as a number 10 impacting a game maybe 3 times, 4 times. So we used to do these 2-month camps where I'd smash him 4 hours a day. He'd rent an apartment in Chapel Street and come to the clinic I had in Wilson Street at the time, off Chapel Street. And he'd spend 2 months with me. And that would be my full-time job at that, where I'd delegate other parts of the business and I'd just strictly work with Danny on pitch, at the beach, in the gym. And all of a sudden, and I get him to do a lot of running-specific stuff with Bowden Babchek, my good mate, the renowned footwork coach, high-performance coach at Hawthorn and Melbourne and the Boomers, dear friend and such an amazing running coach. But all of a sudden, once he'd gone through that process, it's the same kid, but he's impacting a game 27 times, not 3. So I talk about that with your sport, is if you're strong enough and elite at that in your fitness levels, it also just impacts your ability to be able to influence a game over and over and over again.
Then the coaches are going to see more value in you as well. They're going to keep you on for longer, which means you're going to have more eyes on you for longer. You build up your resume even more. You're going to have more weight behind it. Then there's going to be, people knocking on your door in order to be like, hey, can you come over here and do a 2-week trial with us and see how you go? So the opportunities will start to open as you start to focus on the overall development, not just specifically in one area. And in that example, he's managed to stand out. And
then I think not only with that is that the player, when he goes to Europe, must understand his body and have an understanding of how to manage injuries. And if some people get a little bit of a tendency towards patellar tendinopathy or Achilles or groin, they need to have the tools before they go, because when you hit the ground over there, there is no one. Still today, it's improved a lot in England, but still today, a lot of clubs will not really invest much in the sports science. And certainly as an Aussie boy, it's not like you're going into a Manchester United. You'll be going into a lower club where you've got a chance of playing. So there will be no help. So I can't, if you speak to my wife, she'll tell you about the 3 o'clock in the morning phone calls with overseas where I've been doing video hookups with, Stefan Mork in Japan or, Joshi Brillante when he was at Fiorentina, just doing some basic assessments. Oh, mate, remember that exercise I used to give you for your glutes and your quadratus femoris that offset your groin problem? That's the one you got to keep doing again. And all of a sudden I get a text, yeah, mate, it's settled down. So there ain't anything over there. So unless you have a really good understanding of your strength levels and what it is to prepare as a professional player, you can have all the talent in the world, you'll be spat out that system straight away.
Yeah, we're better equipping the athletes for when they do go overseas, when they do get left alone, essentially.
Correct.
Cool. I made a point. Actually, have you seen The Last Dance?
Loved it.
Yeah. And it was a really critical point because I think it was a part of Jordan's career, right, where he was getting bullied off the ball like crazy. And I can't remember how much weight he put on. I think it's maybe like 20 pounds or so, which is about 8 kilos. Basically went through an intensive strength training routine because he was quite like athletic, but he was quite lanky. But then went through that and basically just became this dominant force. And then ended up winning all these championships as a result. So I think it's kind of a good lesson in that. Even the best of the best, even though he was a very talented kid, he still went through the same process that a lot of, everyone else has gone through. Like, there's nothing different.
Yeah, no, and a special mentality. Obviously, those sort of players, that end up becoming international brands, whether it's Roger Federer or Nadal or Novak and Ronaldo, Messi. One thing I have found working with those sort of people, you'll often find they're quite insular about. They find their team and surround themselves with a team. Like you look at Novak, he's got. When I used to work at the Australian Open with the doubles player Sue Wei-She, she was the number one doubles player, and I worked with her and Paul McNamee every summer. We did a pre-season for 4 weeks, then the Australian Open. And so you gave you the insight into the locker room and into the sports med areas, and you just watch the preparation. And, he's got his physio and manager who'll do everything from manage his body through to book the courts for practice, etc. He's got an amazing strength and conditioning coach who's just a tennis person. Watching some of the drills, I've pinched and bought into combat martial arts and those sort of things as well, because the rotational training that he does is just off the charts. But great lesson for young kids as well. If you want your kid as a player to progress, you have to surround yourself with a good team. And that good team doesn't necessarily be at the club, because your club is guaranteed not to be a constant in your life. No kids these days are going to be one club players. It's just not how the world works these days. So you need to have a team around you that can support you wherever you go, and building those good people in your locker are a very, very important part to these successful stories.
Yeah, and sometimes they're very few and far between as well. It's like, how does one go about finding, a support network like that?
Well, you've got to actively look, and so if players are coming to see you from multiple sports and they build an affiliation and there's a genuine care for the player and there's an authenticity, I think that's a great place to start. Because in our game, you tend to fall into one of two categories. There's either those that are anxious about their abilities, and whether that's in physio, sports medicine, strength and conditioning, and so tend to be very insular and not want people to see other people. I mean, half my job these days as well is just, I'm a referral pad, where I just took a phone call on the way here from a father that was anxious about his 16-year-old who'd just done an ACL, wasn't sure, was stressing out about patella and hamstring grafts, which surgeon, got onto Dr. Google, had virtually about to give himself a nervous breakdown. So, but just to be able to steady him and reassure him that the surgeon he was seeing, I've known for 20 years and is a fantastic surgeon, and I've never seen any of the issues in 25 to 30 years of rehab in sport of any of those issues that he was suggesting that he discovered on the internet. So I think looking for people with education, passion and authenticity about what they do will tend to, I think for parents, you're halfway there.
Yeah, and I think the reputation as well. So I think for us, because we work with a lot of swimmers, we've got, and then some of them have done quite well at nationals as well, that we tend to work with one or two swimmers, and those parents will talk to other parents. It's like, oh, where's your daughter going? We're training here. They've been able to do X, Y, and Z. Then you kind of just get that, essentially, you just get that referrals coming in through the door as a result, because you're just delivering on what you initially had intended, was to get them moving better, PBs and whatnot. then all right, then that becomes that kind of perpetual cycle that you start to surround yourself with the right people as well, because they're doing it for the right reasons. Essentially, is to set your child up for future success.
And like I say to people, think about professional sport. The reason why there is so many ups and downs is it's a results-based business. Like you look at a Premier League coach in England, you lose 5 or 6, games in a row. See up, you're gone, and players the same. I've had players who've had their one chance in Europe that have made a mistake, and straight in the bin. You'll never play here again.
Wow.
So it's brutal, and that's why I say it's also the mentality side of it. It's not for everyone. So if you're working with your swimmers and they're all starting to get PBs, people are starting to see results, and that's ultimately, for me, one of the major things you're judged by. And I think the other one for me has always been churning out good quality people. So I've always, in a sense, interviewed people. I want to be part of good, authentic athletes and creating quality people that then, at their door at the end of their career, go on and impact the world in a positive way as well.
Yeah, it's that butterfly effect.
Yeah, correct.
It's cool. I guess what are the key takeaways for parents?
So the key thing, and I've used this analogy a lot, but and knowing the family very well, but I look at so John Aloisi steps up to take the penalty that puts Australia through to the first World Cup in 2005 on that amazing night in Sydney. At the end of the day, John's not only is he going to take the penalty, but he took it on himself, and he tells the story really well where, he said, "I'll take the 5th kick." So it's either going to be hero or villain. So that in itself says the quality of the man, and that he can handle pressure. Now, Rocco, his dad, is in the stands, and Rocco can't take that penalty for him. John's taken the penalty. So, as I say to my own kids when it comes to sport, and as I say to parents everywhere, is this is their journey, and you can't do it for them. Let them have their journey. Surround them with the third-party male mentors or female mentors, the right mentors, because one little message from them, from the right mentor, goes straight into that kid and he learns, as opposed to the parent trying to push it onto them, becomes an argument. Most kids, teenage kids, think their mum and dad's a dickhead, and so they ain't going to listen to us. And so I've got my kids' mentors for their different sports, and they have a wonderful impact on my kids' life, and that is key. So just remember, for the parents, that you can't do it for them. It's the kid's journey, and the passion and the hard work and getting up early and the mentality and the ups and the downs. We can support them and love them, but it's the kid's journey, and so they've got to be able to run that show. And parenting, yes, it is a thankless task, driving out to Casey on a Monday night, getting back at 10 o'clock and, all of that stuff. You can feel like you're eating a shit sandwich sometimes, but again, it's their journey, not ours.
Cool. Oh, that's a great way to wrap it up.
Perfect.
Cool.
Right. Thanks for having me.
Tim. Thanks for coming down. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule and crazy world that you live in.
But it's good what you're doing down here, and I respect what you're doing and wish you all the best.
Cool. I appreciate that. You too.
Thanks, mate.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe, and we'll just continue to continue to do what we do best.
You're doing well, mate. Really well done.
Cool. Thanks. See you next time.
You have just listened to the Inner Athlete Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date with the release of weekly episodes. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram to get great tips on all things youth athlete development and youth mentoring.